Hello and welcome everyone to the Pacific Northwest Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy. Today, this is session 3, Strategies for Preservation Case Studies. Well, strategies for preservation using case studies to talk about that. I am the host, Robin Wolf. I work for Enterprise Community Partners on the Rural and Native American program team, and I'm happy to be hosting you today. Let everybody take a few moments to log on. We will start promptly in about 1 minute at 10:01. Thank you for joining the call today. Really looking forward to sharing with you some case studies from both Oregon and Washington as we talk through making these preservation deals work. Hello again and welcome. I'm Robin Wolf. I'm hosting the Pacific Northwest Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy. Today is session 3. We're looking at strategies for preservation and using a lens of case studies for projects that have been working in both Oregon and Washington or in process. I want to be sure to acknowledge that my colleague Adrienne Norwood today, who's supporting with this call, and she's a tremendous support to our team as we host in virtual space. We will begin this call and every call we host with a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that despite the fact that this is a virtual event, we all come to this space from occupied land. The indigenous history of where I reside here in Denver originally belonged to the Arapaho tribe. And when gold was discovered in the late 1850s, white settlers arrived in the area in large numbers and began asserting their right to the land, leading to the Treaty of Fort Wise in 1861 and the cessation of the land by some of the tribal leaders. In 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Arapaho and Cheyenne people. And soon after, these nations were relocated out of the state of Colorado. Other indigenous nations that are native to Colorado include the Apache, Comanche, Shoshone, and Ute, and the Southern Ute Indian tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, both federally recognized, have their current headquarters here in southern and western portions of the state of Colorado. The Rural and Native American program team at Enterprise is committed to recognizing the ongoing relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and the places where we work. We want to respectfully acknowledge and honor all indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. And we are also cognizant that acknowledgement comes with it the responsibility to demonstrate the inclusion of indigenous perspectives through action and in our work as we work to create greater access to safe and affordable housing. That brings us again to our work. As I said, I am Robin Wolf. I'm the Senior Program Director for Rural Housing at Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise Community Partners is an organization with a vision that we will create a country where home and community are stepping stones to more. And our mission is to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. Just start out with a brief agenda for today. We are in the midst of welcome and introductions. And then we will get to some case studies in the state of Oregon, some time for Q&A. As always, I will leave time for a break. We will then have case studies for the state of Washington, questions and wrap up. You will find if you're joining us from Idaho, Alaska, or from other states and just listening in, that these case studies will be helpful for you to analyze your projects no matter where you are, but it's also helpful for us to kind of think from this regional lens to have some of these examples on the ground. A couple of housekeeping items. Please use chat feature to submit questions. We also have Q&A feature. Either one of those will work. We will be monitoring both of those. After the presentation, we'll open up the lines for Q&A. So you may also use the raise hand feature, and we will be able to open up your line so you can ask a question live if you prefer to ask your question in that way. All participants will receive a copy of the webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides. Also any supplemental materials. I think today we will have a fact sheet on one of the products that will come with you that will be sent to you after the session. Please be patient with us if we experience any technical difficulties. We have folks out in the field in rural parts of the state, and sometimes there can be lags with broadband, but we hope that you're able to be patient with us, and we will get through them and do our best to work through those difficulties. Again, you're taking part in the Rural Preservation Academy. The framework for the Academy is as follows. We look at these kind of 5 major blocks of content, identification, pre-development, acquisition, rehab, and stewardship, which leads us into conversations about property management and compliance as well. And for the Pacific Northwest, here are sort of our kind of buckets. We are still sort of in overview and introduction as we talk through strategies for preservation. Our May 12th session, we'll be talking about funding for projects beyond USDA Rural Development. And then we will get into some kind of deal structuring, even more nitty gritty into making these projects pencil, and followed by conversations on property management and some conversations on how do we advocate for this to continue to happen in our space. And we also want to make sure we thank our partners, Fannie Mae, Oregon Housing and Community Services, JP Morgan Chase, and the Collins Foundation all have provided financial support. We also want to be sure to thank the USDA RD Multifamily Office, the Washington Department of Commerce, and the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, all who have been part of the preparation for this academy. So thank you very much for all of that. And with that, I am going to introduce our next speaker, Rob Prash. Rob Prash is the Preservation Director at NOAA. Rob directs the Oregon Housing Preservation Project hosted by NOAA, and under his leadership, the coordination and advocacy, the OHPP partners have been successful in preserving nearly 300 at-risk federally assisted affordable housing properties. Rob is active locally and nationally with advocacy and resource development on preservation specifically, and his experience includes working as senior project manager for the Housing Development Center and working for the Preservation Program Coordinator and Multifamily Asset Manager at HUD. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rob, and Adrian will put up your PowerPoint, and we will learn about what's going on in the state of Oregon.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Robin. Nice to see everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. Again, I am the Preservation Program Director with the Network for Oregon Affordable Housing. We do quite a bit of preservation lending and other kinds of lending. And I will start today by talking a little bit about NOAA as an organization and a lender, and set the landscape a little bit for preservation in Oregon, and then we'll bring in a couple of developers that work with. But keep in mind, my presentation is sort of focused on NOAA as a lender, and I think Marty later will talk more about the details of some transactions and so forth. But let's get started. Adrian, next slide. Thank you. So NOAA is a certified CDFI. We were formed in 1990 by the Oregon Bankers Association to provide permanent financing for multifamily properties. And at that time, tax credit program was just coming on, and the banks didn't want any part of 20 or 30-year term loans. They love to do construction loans, but they didn't want that. So we're one of about 23 or 4 bank consortia around the country that do this type of work. We currently have about $280 million in loan capital that is in various pools that revolve. We offer permanent financing that go along with the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But we also offer short-term acquisition financing, which was created to do preservation deals, and it's been quite successful. We've done 36 total loans, I think. A lot of HUD Section 8 deals. We also do pre-development lending, which you'll see it was a part of one of these projects that we're going to talk about. And we have a new tax-exempt bond program. Well, we're also really active, my boss, Bill Van Vliet, and I, in housing advocacy and policy here in Oregon, including preservation of rental housing and manufactured housing. So next slide, please. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Oregon Housing Preservation Project, which Robin mentioned. It was formed in 2007 to develop strategies to preserve Oregon's affordable housing, which was starting to come to the end of the original financing and contract terms. So the original focus was on Oregon Housing's bond finance Section 8 portfolio, which is a little over 4,000 units, and they had been done over a period of about 8 years and with 100% Section 8, and they were starting to expire. And it sort of brought a lot of partners together to try to figure out how to preserve them. And those included Oregon Housing, of course, the city of Portland, which had about 1,000 of those units, all downtown senior disabled properties. But we also had HUD and Rural Development around the table and a number of stakeholders and quite a few developers, both nonprofit and for-profit, were there. And we really attracted the attention of philanthropy. So Manor Memorial Trust was like the first foundation in, and they helped us bring another 4 or 5 foundations in that continue to support the work. So this steering committee that was formed looked at best practices around the country and established some goals to preserve the properties and strategies that we could use to try to preserve them. One of the main things that we've done over the years is pursue a legislative agenda focused on preservation and advocated for dedicated preservation funding through the legislature. And that has worked quite well. We've had over $100 million in dedicated preservation funds come through the legislature over the years. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about 2 case studies in Oregon, kind of the opposites. One is a very small Section 8 property in Nissa, Oregon, which is way on the east side, right up against the Idaho border practically. And Christy Rodriguez, who's the executive director with the Housing Authority of Malheur and Harney County, she may be joining us late. I'm hoping she'll be able to join us, but she had something come up that took her away this morning. Oh, she's there. Hi, Christy. And Clayton Crowhurst, who's the housing developer with Northwest Housing Alternatives. And they have kind of a unique approach, a collaboration that I think would be useful for folks to hear about, especially for small organizations in that kind of lack the capacity and they're kind of out in the rural areas. The other property we're going to look at is a 2-project bond deal that Chrisman Development did. The 2 sites are in Winston and the other is in St. Helens. They're about 250 miles apart, I think, something like that. 58 total units, RD preservation. Shelley Cullen, who's the director of development with Chrisman Development, she will join us when we get to talking about that. And I'd just say, I think between Shelley and I, we're probably getting close to 50 years experience working in preservation. She has got a wealth of information and experience. She's worked for years at Oregon Housing Community Services and then joined Chrisman, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, and they have been pedal to the metal ever since. Next slide. So as I started to say, Oregon really has prioritized preservation with a very robust policy framework that includes both the legislation efforts and significant public resources coming through our state legislature. We've enjoyed very broad base stakeholder support and input from nonprofits and for-profits both. Since 2007, just as an example of that support, Oregon Housing has invested over $260 million of their soft resources, and which has helped preserve 15,000 total units. Just the tax credit equity invested in those preservation transactions exceeds 700 million. And when we're talking with legislatures, one of the things that we always emphasize is that the long-term subsidy contract extensions that come with preservation transactions lock in that subsidy stream for 20 and sometimes 30 years. So we try to put a value on that. And our estimate is that those contract extensions will bring $1.6 billion in subsidy dollars over the next coming years. So it really helps with the effort to secure those state resources. Next slide. Just continuing on, developers in Oregon have a lot of opportunities to secure preservation funding. And so Oregon Housing typically has somewhere between 3 and 6 competitive funding rounds annually that preservation projects can compete in. They maintain a 25% set aside for preservation projects in the 9% NOFA. And typically in most years, they would offer a gap NOFA for bond transactions. This year that was canceled due to COVID impact on lottery sales because those funds come through lottery bonds. But we expect that will be back next year. And there's a group of us working on the legislature this year to increase that funding amount significantly. The funds that we lost were $20 million that did not come about because of the canceled NOFA. But there are tons of other sources that get associated with these various NOFAs, and including millions in gap resources from the General Housing Account Program, which is money that's raised through a doc recording fee. Then we've got trust fund and the federal trust fund, weatherization funds, and so forth. And we also have the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit, which I'll talk about briefly in just a minute. Next slide. In addition to really being focused on preservation, Oregon's done just an outstanding job preserving rural projects across the state. 85 rural development properties have been preserved with 2,400 units or so of rental assistance. To put that in perspective, our portfolio is somewhere around 180, 185 properties right now, something like that. So it represents a very high percentage of the properties, and there's lots of effort still going on to preserve what's out there. We've also preserved 67 rural HUD project-based Section 8 properties. And I think, as we've talked about in this academy already, some of these little properties in these small communities may be the only multifamily rental in the town or city, and in some cases, it's certainly the only subsidized properties. So it's really important to preserve them. 98 Oregon cities and towns have had a project preserved since 2007. That's a lot, 98. 59% of the preserved properties have been in communities with populations under 35. So again, I just want to emphasize that the policy framework and the application of those policies has really had a huge impact on rural Oregon. 34% of the preserved properties are in communities with populations under 10,000. And so again, that's really having an impact on rural parts of the state. Next slide, please. This is just a visual representation of where those preserved properties are. 325 properties preserved now so far to date, 11,500 with rental assistance units. You can see from the map, these properties are really preserved all over the state. As you would expect, there's a concentration along the I-5 corridor, but up and down the coast, Central Oregon, North and Northeast Oregon, you know, a really good distribution of those resources. So next slide. Before we jump into the case studies, I just wanted to talk briefly about a unique resource we have here in Oregon. It's called the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit. And, you know, a lot of states have affordable housing tax credits, but ours is unique in that it's not capitalized. It's not sold for equity. It provides a credit to the banks that participate in the program. And in exchange for the tax credit, the banks agree to reduce the interest rates on their loans by up to 4%. And then the tax credit is used to offset their lower interest rates, the revenue. Generally, that program requires that the savings, all of the savings from that reduced interest rate, flow through to the project in the form of lower rents. And so it's very effective for getting really lowering the rents in affordable housing projects. But where it's really interesting and effective with preservation projects that have project-based rental assistance, federal rental assistance, is that the legislature decided to exempt those properties from the pass-through requirement. And the reason they did that was because by requiring the pass-through and reducing the rents, it would only reduce the amount of federal funds that come through to the state. And so they decided, let the rents stay where they are, get the maximum federal subsidy that you can, and instead use that interest rate savings to finance larger loans. And that in turn then reduces the need for other public gap resources. So it's really effective for preservation projects. And whenever I'm talking to a developer, if they're considering doing a preservation project, I always tell them, if you don't use the affordable housing tax credit, you're leaving resources on the table. So that's that. And we'll see an example of how that impacts a project here in a minute. So next slide, please. I'm going to invite Christy and Clayton to unmute and turn the cameras on if they care to. I guess Clayton is so far, I guess maybe both of you won't be able to use your cameras, but if you feel like it, please do. We're going to talk about Nissa Court. And this is a pretty typical kind of wood-framed, 30-some-year-old Section 8 property out in Nissa. And Christy and the Housing Authority purchased it a few years ago. Let's see, next slide. Just show you where it is, right on the border there near Ontario. 7-unit multifamily property with HUD project-based Section 8. They actually did a 2-step transaction. The Housing Authority did. They were managing the property and they had the opportunity to purchase it. And they had an opportunity to purchase it at a very low cost. And NOAA provided a pre-development loan, which you'll see that helped purchase that and get it into their hands so they could put together a permanent preservation transaction. So this is one of like the 2-step transactions that we've been part of with using our acquisition financing. This one was so small in terms of the amount of loan, the size of the loan, that we didn't run it through our OHAF loan program. But they applied and received the resources that they needed to preserve it in last summer's 2020 NOFA. So they got GHAP funds and Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits. And what makes this interesting to the group here today, again, is the collaboration between Northwest Housing Alternatives and the Housing Authority. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But next slide, please. This is just a very basic sources and uses for the property. We didn't break it out in a lot of detail, but as you can see, they used, they will use $1.15 million in the General Housing Account Program funds from Oregon Housing. And again, those are grant funds. So it doesn't impact the operations. It's not a burden. So that's a really important fund. And these are raised through our document recording fee. So every real estate transaction, when there's a document recorded, there's a fee levied against on the recording of those documents. And it turns out to raise about $20 million or so a year for affordable housing. It's a great program. NOAA will be providing a permanent loan of $575,000 with the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit at 1%. So we'll see how that goes when we look down the road here. And then just quickly, the uses, there was a very small acquisition loan through our pre-dev program. And Christy, if I'm remembering right, the acquisition was $75,000. And it was largely a gifted, a gift of the property, but there was a partner that had expenses they wanted covered. So, and then construction and development. So next slide just shows the income and expenses. And I'm gonna just open it up here to Christy and Clayton to kind of talk about how this project came together, what their collaboration looks like, both from an organizational perspective, and then how it really, that collaboration brings efficiencies to the project. And so, Christy, do you want to talk first just a little bit about how you came to acquire the property?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. We came to acquire the property. So I've been executive director for a couple years now, but the prior executive director was approached by GC, I think it was like GCA or GC Partnership. They're out of Salem, majority of them are out of Salem. And this was kind of a mom and pop type of ownership between 3 different parties that owned Nissacourt at the time. And so we were approached to manage the property, but it was supposed to turn into managing the property and then eventually buying the property within a year of managing the property. It took us a little longer than a year, and then I took over the Housing Authority as the ED. And so at that time, we were looking at more of the resources because the timing was kind of off in regards to acquisition and then applying for funds. So once we knew about the lottery-backed bond funds that were going to come out and the preservation funds that were going to come out, we decided to do the 2-step process to acquire Nissacourt. So we had already approached NOAA, and NOAA had already informed us that they would be more than happy to assist us to give us that pre-development loan for $75,000, as the project is practically being, at that time was practically being given to us. So we decided to do the 2-step process where we would go ahead and purchase the project and then apply for the preservation funds that came out a few months later. And we did a collaboration with Northwest Housing Alternatives with Clayton Crowhurst, who majorly stepped in and showed us all the ropes on how to put an application together for Oregon Housing. And we now have just developed a very strong partnership. So now we're the owners, and now we're looking forward to exciting construction phase of the project. So.
Yeah, and I'll hop in here. Rob, I think you forgot to mention one of the coolest facts about NISA is that it's the thunder egg capital of the world. So for any rock hounds out there, you'll appreciate knowing about that. But yeah, it's really for me, and I'm actually calling today out from the project that I am working on out in Ontario, which is just about 15 minutes north, and that's Ontario, Oregon, not California or Canada. And it's just been really great for me to collaborate with the Housing Authority. It's definitely been kind of a two-way street between us in that I do have another housing preservation application under my belt. So I was able to lend some help to that effort, and also have dealt with a HAP contract, two HAP contract renewals, as well as some LIPRA trickiness, which is always adds some complications. So this project doesn't have that layer on there, which is really nice. But on my end, I've really gained a lot of community connections through Christie and the Housing Authority. You know, I think one of the biggest barriers to an organization like mine coming into smaller communities is that we don't know truly what the needs are in those communities. And so I think it's, you know, you can't just come into places and say, all right, this is our vision for what we think you need. I think it's really a critical step to actually talk to housing authorities, service providers, residents, and figure out, okay, how do you actually want this project to be built? What kind of services do you need? So for us, it's been super beneficial in that we've been working on a project that's it's actually literally right across the street from their offices in Ontario. Yeah, in terms of the mechanics of this, it really, the application dovetailed nicely with an application I was putting in for 9% LIHTC on the Ontario project I was working on. So it was really easy to collaborate on those two applications kind of at the same time. And it really seemed like this was a great starting point for the Housing Authority in terms of getting back into development and rehab of some of their properties, and really being able to cut their teeth and build that capacity. I think throughout this process, I have always kind of pitched our role as a kind of an assistant and a capacity builder, as opposed to us completely handling every aspect of the project and, you know, and then turning it back over to the Housing Authority. It's really been my goal to work with them and not just for them on this project. And I think a few of the things that have been tricky about this is, one, you know, its size and location. So getting kind of qualified due diligence reports, all of that done is tricky. There's also the added barrier of a lot of MWESB and kind of equity goals that are coming with new funding applications. Like I really appreciate those and appreciate the effort put into that. But those goals are so much harder to hit in rural communities, where a lot of contractors just aren't registered officially with state agencies, because there's been a real lack of outreach to those folks to get them registered as MWESB contractors, even though these communities in Eastern Oregon are actually some of the most diverse places in the state. So that's kind of my quick plug on that end of things. But yeah, Rob, what kind of questions do you maybe want to dig into specific to the project, or any details of the financing or transaction?
Thanks, Clayton. Well, I did want to look at the effect of the OHTC, but before we do that, Can you talk, both of you, can you talk a little bit more about this model of collaboration as it benefits somebody, an organization like the Housing Authority that's, you know, small, it's remote, and it doesn't have, you know, access to a typical pool of consultants, and the project's so small it can't generally support the consulting costs that usually requires. And I know that you've found efficiencies in both like architectural construction, that sort of thing. So maybe if you could hit on that a little bit. And then I've got another slide that we can look at the OHTC impact.
Yeah, and Christy, I'll let you take that one first and I'll draft in behind you.
Thanks, Clayton. So with the collaboration, the way that this kind of works is it makes it very, the challenging area of all of this is the capacity. We operate such a very small housing authority. There's only 9 of us that work in there, and that's including maintenance. And so it's capacity that we just don't have in order to build up all of these big applications and put in these big applications to Oregon Housing to seek funding sources. Another thing is the expertise. You know, we just don't have that proper expertise the way Clayton has. So it's been very beneficial for us just to kind of learn the ropes and have that specific type of mentorship and partnership with him in order for us to build up our portfolio in regards to development and putting together these specific types of applications that look appealing to Oregon Housing in order to seek funding to build affordable housing or continue to build affordable housing in this small rural area. We lack a lot of housing in this area. So you can see Malheur County is a huge area where there's a lot of poverty. And so affordable housing is something that's huge in this area, but it's more of a capacity issue that we have. And so when we're able to collaborate with somebody that's bigger and has learned more and has more properties under their belt, it just helps us an immense amount. And not only speaking for our agency, but speaking for other community partners as well, where we've been able to kind of come together. I think Clayton has really showed this area in regards to how important it is to come together as a community in order to make things happen in this small area.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll definitely follow up on that. That it's really nice on my end to be able to leverage a lot of our Northwest Housing Alternatives portfolio data to kind of help put together comps, both in, you know, the appraisal market study kind of process, but also as we're, you know, projecting project income, expenses, and really zero in on, you know, what looks good, what can we do in the construction scope to kind of reduce expenses. So that's been one nice thing that, you know, I definitely am not an island at the organization. I, you know, lean really heavily on, you know, my development team coworkers and our asset management folks, because we do have a wealth of information at the organization. And so that's been really helpful. You know, on my end, I come from a construction background. You know, I've been swinging hammers 10 years before coming into housing development. And so, you know, I think for me, it's been really important to be an advocate for the housing authority. I think that there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there who see rural housing authorities and other rural organizations as easy pickings for a quick buck and doing shoddy work. So I'm, you know, have the privilege of being plugged in with several, you know, larger general contractors and architects that really have a high quality standard for what they're doing. And I feel like that's one of the strongest things I can advocate for is, you know, really effective use of some super limited resources that rural housing authorities have. And I will just put out there that the housing authority that Christy operates is both the Malheur and Harney County Housing Authority, which, if anybody looks at a map of Oregon, that is basically all of southeastern Oregon. And another fun fact is that it has a location that's basically the farthest from any Starbucks in the lower 48. Just to give you a sense of the land area and the huge distances that they have to cover as a team of 9 people. So, I can't help them with, voucher compliance. I can't help them with fixing, leaking pipes. But it has been nice to be able to help build some capacity, at least in the development realm, and kind of bring some of my, at least, construction experience into the mix.
And that's great. Adrian, can you move us to the next slide, please? I wanted to touch on this, and then we'll have to wrap this up and move on to Shelley, and then leave a little time for questions. But as I mentioned, the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit for preservation projects is really a valuable tool. And this shows side by side for the same loan amount, $575,000 at 1% interest rate, your monthly payment would be $1,850. Without the OHTC, you'd be looking at over $3,000 a month payment. And what that does is reduces the amount of gap financing that you need over the term of the loan. And just by the annual amount down there, you could see $15,960. So Clayton or Christy, do you want to add anything to that? Simple explanation.
Yeah. I think the coolest part about OHTC for preservation projects where there's an existing contract like this is the expectation is that you have existing tenants in place and that you are not going to need to do a pass-through and reduce income to the project. To Rob's point earlier, if you are not using OHTCs on a preservation project, you are leaving lots of free money on the table. From that earlier operating statement that Rob had up here, at the end of the day, our NOI is, or after debt service is, in the $6,000 to $8,000 range. So it's not like this property is just flinging off cash left and right.
No.
So having that 1% interest rate, it's not just a nice thing, it's a make or break. This project would not be feasible without this program. It's truly a struggle right now, to put anything together with construction materials, what they are, but with some of these resources, it's possible. It's not easy, but it's possible. So.
All right, well, I wanted to thank you both for joining us, and let's move in and look at a contrasting project, which is much bigger scale and more complexity involved, and bring in Shelley Cullen from Chrisman Development. This property is called Two Rivers Apartments, 2 RD projects combined into one transaction using conduit bonds and 4% tax credits. St. Helens and Winston, and I think these are clearly as rehabbed, but I look at the St. Helens property especially, and it's really sort of a very typical kind of RD property from that era. There's a lot of them that were built like that, and this is quite an improvement over some of those. So next slide, please, Adrian. Just a quick summary of the property and a map that shows you where it's located. The 2 properties, St. Helens, Oregon, up in the very northwest corner of the state, and then Winston, which is down by Roseburg on the I-5 corridor in the sort of in the center south part. Total 58 units. 39 with rental assistance, and Oregon Housing was awarded funding for this transaction in the Preservation Gap NOFA in 2017. And that provided Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits, a big award of housing preservation funds, which are grants, and the low-income housing tax credits and conduit bond. Construction was completed in 2020, and the loan converted, the construction loan paid off and converted. So next slide, and then we'll just look at this quickly, but Shelley, you can jump in anytime if you want, but I just put up a very simple sources and uses here, just showing the main sources, the temporary use, the short-term use of the tax-exempt bonds for construction. And then, if I'm remembering right, Shelley, the amount of the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit was kept in the NOFA, so we ended up with a bifurcated loan, part with OHTC and part without.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. Okay. They've since changed that, and they have so much of that tax credit available now that they actually have a pool, what they're calling the OHTC pool, that has 200 million or something in it. You can just go and ask for those credits and on a rolling basis and get them. So that's great. Total project cost, a little over almost $10.5 million. Next slide, please. And then there's your rents at the two different sites. The rates on the loan information side, the rates on the loan with OHTC and without, and the profit and the payments, principal and interest payments, and then just sort of the overall big picture details of the loan. So let's bring Shelley in here. And Shelley, you guys have, Christman has done a ton of portfolio transactions. And it would be interesting to hear why that approach works so well for you, and where you find efficiencies in that approach.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Well, Christman Development has basically been around for 30 years. Doug and Tony Christman started the company in the early 90s. And so they've focused a lot, probably 90% of the portfolio are these RD acquisition rehabilitation projects. We've done over 73 developments and have about 2,300 units. So we have a lot of experience, you know, trial and error, and we've learned from each project. But the one nice thing about the portfolio, if Adrian, if you could go back to a slide to see sources and uses, is that these are two separate RD projects, and they're not consolidated. They're a portfolio because they're too far away, and normally RD just will allow consolidations when you're in the same market area. But it's considered one tax credit project. So the advantages there are that you get your tax credit equity, and you can share that equity between the two projects when it comes to financing your uses. And so if a project, say, needs a little bit more rehab, then you can pull in some equity there. So that's one advantage of doing the bond force and having this portfolio, is being able to maximize your tax credit equity between the two projects. And so that's helpful. But we, part of it is just our experience in doing this. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Portland RD office at the time. Things have changed since, but we just have received a lot of support from them. And we're one of the few developers that really tackle the RD projects, because the RD process does take some time, and you've got to have the patience to do this. This project took 8 months to close from the time we submitted the application to RD to closing. So that doesn't include the pre-development time period and doing the actual application to Oregon Housing, and then all the due diligence to get to your RD application. So it does take some time to get through the process and work through all the requirements, but I don't really have much more to add. This, our goal on all of these projects is to do the amount of rehab to make the project sustainable for the next 20 to 30 years. And so we really have to push the envelope on, the rehab we can do with the resources that we have. Of course, the goal always is the physical structure and the exterior envelope, and then what we can do on the interiors. And these particular projects, we were able to, as you can see from the pictures, do siding and roofing and, replacing old wood stairs. And then we did substantial interior rehabs with cabinets and flooring and appliances on all the units. So the housing preservation funds being that large, the 4.3 million really helped us get to that too, to be able to provide a sustainable project instead of just Band-Aid and having to think about some sort of recapitalization in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and I would add, early on in the preservation effort, there were some bond deals that were done with minimal rehab, or at least a level of rehab that wasn't really sustainable. And Oregon Housing changed that practice and really looks at doing, as Shelley said, 20 to 30 year rehabs to reposition them, and so that they don't have to come back, in a short amount of time. So.
Yeah, as an example, we did 4 separate properties in 2007, and the rehabilitation on those was like $9,000 a unit, and this is like $97,000 a unit. Yeah. So, now we're at the point where we're looking at, going through hopefully the Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit NOFA to do some recapitalization on those projects, because that wasn't, sustainable. I mean, 2 of the projects didn't receive siding, and it was very minimal rehab. The goal was to preserve them and just not thinking far enough in the future and having the resources that Oregon has now to be able to do a substantial rehab. So it is pretty important. I did see a question. I don't know if you want me to respond. One popped up from Marty.
Yeah, that'd be great, actually, Shelley. If you want to go in and answer that question.
Marty asked about, I think, the length of our option agreements. We've been pretty fortunate. We have a lot of relationships with current owners in the state. They know about our organization. So we pretty much are able to time our options based on, the due diligence and our estimation for closing the transaction with RD. So we've been able to do options a year to a year and a half out. A lot of the owners understand the process with RD and that it can take time. So we've been able to have some flexibility there. We've had to do some extensions, but we've pretty much been able to, get long enough options to be able to get us to closing.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Shelley, for answering that question. I have a question, I think, of this whole Oregon crew, and it builds, I think, off a question you kind of alluded to earlier, Rob, and that's with in the case of the example with Christy and Clayton and Northwest Housing Alternatives coming in to help with navigating that development, or that process, right, and all the application. Was that paid for with developer fee, and how was that structured using soft funds that come aside from RD? We know that sometimes as folks are, especially working on RD transfers, that becomes complicated as how you would pay the developer fee for things like a consultant that might really be necessary to help a project get done.
Yeah, good question, Robin. And I will say that we're a little bit lucky on Nissa Court in that there's no RD funds involved there. So we've just got the HUD HAP contract. So yeah, I can't comment on what would be allowed or not allowed in an RD transaction. We are actually, billing for services as just under a separate consultant line item. I think I wanted to make sure that the housing authority was able to actually get that developer fee from the project to use to support, future development and build some of that capacity. I think I'm also lucky enough to be working for an organization that allows me to, kind of donate some of my time and effort, and also just see the advantage of I'm already working in the region and have a project right across the street from their office. And so, luckily we have the resources here in-house to be able to allow me to do some of that and not need to collect what you might see from a typical development consultant.
Robin, and I'm just going to add on to that they are sharing the services of the same architect and the same general contractor. So those efficiencies really help make that work.
No, I think that's a great point. Thank you, Rob, for highlighting that too. I know a follow-up question from Brian Shelton Kelly at Neighborworks Umpqua asking about whether or not there's concern with the location of properties from the portfolio standpoint, on behalf of like the equity investors on the LIHTC side.
Yeah, I saw that. Not really. I mean, we've been using the same investor, I would say, for the past 4 or 5 years. So we have done a substantial amount of portfolio scattered site projects all over the state, up and down the I-5 corridor, Eastern Oregon. So that really hasn't been an issue. I think one of the things that helps with that is that these are subsidized projects. So we're not necessarily relying on the market. I don't know if some of you know that when you do an initial transfer, RD will look at what are the current market rents and what are the tax credit allowed rents. And the maximum you could go to increase rents, if that's your case, or sometimes you might have to lower, is you start at the lesser of the CERQ or the tax credit rent. And then after that, you're on your budget based or your allowed increases. And so we're able to sort of underwrite to that assumption. And so, the more units you have that are subsidized, I think that takes away some of that concern of the rural areas and a kind of an unsteady market.
Right, because it minimizes the cost burden that goes on, that gets passed through to the renter based on the sustained rental assistance. I am really appreciative of that portfolio strategy because it's hard otherwise to get the economies of scale. Again, I think, Rob's point just about kind of efficiencies of use. Sometimes you can't achieve the right economies of scale to secure tax credits unless you have, the right number of units, and that might require congregating a couple of projects in rural communities, because a lot of times they're 20 units a piece or 24 or 12. And so that might be really, I think it's a really important additional strategy, and something that, as we highlight, since this was the strategies for preservation session, something to highlight as a different kind of way at looking at a project, to think about it in a portfolio is really important. I also just want to lift up that Oregon that has been highlighted as I look at these sources and the sources and uses, is that you have a tremendous amount of assets available to you in the state that I know are not available in every state. I'm sure our partners here in the other states in the region are like, oh, we don't have access to all of those sources. The OAHTC seems to be exceptionally helpful, right? If you're thinking about that 1% reduced interest rate and being able to pass that through onto that operating pro forma savings. So just a shout out to what has happened on the policy side and those who have advocated to get these sources available in the state. It's really important that these resources are available and are ones that we can look at to see if there's ways to replicate them as models in other states as well. And thanks, Rob, for explaining that 4%, how the LIHTC works, because I was not clear on that before. As you said, other states have that state tax, the affordable housing tax credit that aligns with 4%, but they don't all work in the same way that they do in the state of Oregon. And couple of follow-up questions. One from Brian Ketchum at Catholic Charities. Did you experience any relocation issues with existing tenants as you did your rehab? And how did you approach this from both a budgeting perspective as well as working with tenants?
Is that for me?
Sure, Shelley.
Dealing with tenants, that's always a unique experience. With these particular projects, of course, they don't have homes. That has its own unique criteria you have to follow with uniform relocation. But on these tax credit projects, we analyze the tenants and their incomes as part of our due diligence to see if we are going to run up against any tenants that will be over the 60% allowed income for tax credits, because RD does allow tenants' incomes to go up to 80. So we've been fortunate to not have a lot, but there are some. And so then we sort of follow, I think HUD allows for incentives. So we developed sort of an incentive program, and we sort of analyze what are market rents in the area and we just come up with an incentive for folks to move. Sometimes they do that before we acquire, but shortly after we acquire the property. We are usually income qualifying tenants before the acquisition of the property. If Christmas Development also has a subsidiary company, Viridian Management, that manages the properties. So we also try to, if we aren't already managing the properties, we work with the owner and try to get management within 90 to 120 days of acquisition so that we can start the income qualifying process within our own management company. But we do have a formula that we work through as far as temporary relocation with the tenants. So we do provide them. Usually they're out 5 to 7 days. So we have a calculation for lodging and meals and moving expenses if they need it, if we need to help with moving on like some senior projects. So we have a formula that we put together, and it's included in our development budget. And so that's financed with the sources that we have. So usually, I don't think we've ever had more than maybe 3 tenants that have had to be relocated in the last few years. So we've been pretty fortunate as far as permanent relocation. But on the temporary, we have a pretty good formula that works pretty well. And our construction team, we know how long it takes to get units. We usually do building at a time so we can, sort of move tenants around that way. So hopefully that helps.
No, thank you, Shelley. That's really helpful. And Clayton put some comments in the chat on that as well. We're at 11:03, which is, a little bit past our halfway point. And we kind of talked through the break, but I think that's okay. I'm going to move on. Thank you first to thank our Oregon case studies, Rob, for putting this all together for us and being the glue that tied these case studies together and gave us some framework for how the funding sources come together in Oregon. And to Shelley and to Clayton and to Christy, thank you so much for helping us walk through these case studies. And I'm sure I'm going to use some of these snapshots of slides as we continue to talk about how the sources and uses come together in real life projects as I go forward and talk about possible sources and uses throughout the states. And now we're going to open and move on to our conversations with partners in Washington State. So I am Adrienne is adjusting slides right now. And we will talk with the team from ORF. So Isabel is joining us from ORF, and ORF is the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing. It's located in Washington State. And Isabel is going to help talk us through, I believe you're talking about Sunnyside Manor, Isabel, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, fantastic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin. And my name is Isabel Garcia, and I'm an orphan, and I'm a housing developer with the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing for about 2 years now. And I will also be presenting our case study with our sponsor, Dave Roberts, senior developer with the Spokane Housing Ventures. And we'll be sharing our experience and with the Sunnyside Manor apartments. And David, are you there?
I'm here in my video. Oh, okay, now I can start the video. Good morning, everyone. You know, one broad overview comment I wanted to make is that, you know, we don't go out necessarily looking for 12-unit properties. The primary motivation with regard to Sunnyside Manor 2 is preservation, but it also happens to be right next door to Sunnyside Manor 1, a 24-unit senior complex that we own. So a secondary motivation is to have better management efficiency in Yakima County.
Next slide, please. Okay, Sunnyside Manor Apartments. We'll share a little bit of a description of this project. And this project was placed in service in 1988, or about 33 years ago. And it's located in a very small rural town in central Washington with about 17,000 population. And it is mainly supported by agriculture industry. And it has 12 units, 10 one-bedroom unit apartments, and 2 two-bedroom units, and with 1 ADA accessible unit. And it has 2 L-shaped single-family story buildings. And like Dave said, it's right next to Sunnyside Manor 2, multifamily project of 24 units. So we're dealing with the same seller, and who has been very supportive and very willing to enter into this agreement with Spokane Housing Ventures.
Yeah, that's a comment I wanted to add a little bit more on. It has been extremely, extremely helpful to have a patient seller. We got started on this project in 2018. It is 2021, and we haven't closed the acquisition yet. But the seller has had confidence in us and has provided for the extensions to the purchase and sale agreement to allow us to get to the point where we are now.
Yes, and I'm happy to say that we do have a tentative closing date for May 26, 2021. And we're into our 5th PSA extension. So it's been quite a ride, and we're so thankful for the seller that he is accompanying us in this journey. And next slide, please. And this project is currently serving senior citizens, or who are over 60 years and older, and also people with disabilities. So we have a combination of tenants, and they are at or below 50% area median income for the Yakima County, which means that individuals have to earn less than $24,750 per year, which in this case is easily attainable because most of the tenants, or probably all, are on fixed income. And we are happy that this project came into the Spokane Housing Ventures portfolio, because as much as, you know, it's a long process and time consuming, we know that the tenants will not have to worry about seeking a new place to rent and struggling to find affordable housing in the area, given the very low vacancy rates in Yakima County overall. And especially with a fixed income, it's probably makes it harder for them to find an affordable housing unit. And our goal is that the planned scope of work will bring this property into compliance with RD's requirements and increase its rating from a C to an A. And we're also planning to bring the property to code and meet accessibility requirements. We also plan to complete health and safety items and address years 1 through 5 of the CNA items identified that need to be fixed or improved or enhanced to prolong the durability and sustainability for a few more decades on this project. Anything you want to add, Dave?
Yeah, just briefly, a little more detail on the management efficiency. Presently, we have 2 complexes next door to each other. Each one has a rental office. Each one has a site manager, although not full-time in either case. This will enable us to more steadily keep skilled site and maintenance people to deal with 36 rather than 24 or 12 units. Hopefully we will migrate to a 1 office situation with more hours available for maintenance, spread those costs across 36 units, and gain efficiency that will benefit the tenants in helping to keep rents stable.
And I do want to add that the rents will remain the same post-transfer. Next slide, please. We do have a combination of funding. Unfortunately, one source is not enough to make the project work and complete the acquisition and also the rehabilitation work that is needed. So we have a combination of funding sources. One of them, and the first funder that provided an award for this project, is through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines. And there's the USDA debt assumption, and through the Washington State Housing Trust Fund preservation program, and also thanks to Enterprise Community Partners, totaling the project cost for acquisition and rehabilitation at 1.7 million for Sunnyside Manor. And I do want to mention that it is the collaboration and cooperation of the combination of funders is so important to make this preservation projects possible and to prolong the life of the projects. If it wasn't for the collaboration of the multiple funders, I don't think that this could be possible with just RD and other limited resources. So seeking the financing sources, and it is time consuming, but it's very rewarding because you know that you will be saving these units for tenants who would otherwise have the risk of becoming homeless or going into an overcrowded housing situation, or end up paying more than 30% of their monthly gross income to housing expenses if it wasn't for Spokane Housing Ventures stepping up and preserving these units.
A little overview of the structure of this financing. And remember, we got started in 2018, and at the time, there were no identifiable funds, whether through USDA, whether through the Housing Trust Fund in the state of Washington, to do the rehab work. So our application to the FHLB was on the basis, and the transfer application to USDA was on the basis of acquisition only, with a commitment that we would pursue the funding for the rehab as we found opportunities. It was 2 years later, very fortunately, the Department of Commerce in the state of Washington, the Housing Trust Fund, put up through the legislative agenda a $10 million preservation fund, and the facts and circumstances with Sunnyside Manor 2 matched up very well with the priorities there. So despite the fact we were pushing to close the acquisition with the FHLB money and the assumption of the RD mortgage loan, we now had a means to do the rehab work. So with the additional help from Enterprise to deal with some of the closing costs, we've now gotten approval. Well, I should say conditional approval, but we've gotten the letter of conditions from USDA to close this acquisition and then move forward with the rehab work. So sometimes perhaps taking a long time has some odd benefits because, having this preservation fund come available last year was key to getting this development pushed forward.
Next slide, please. And with preservation, as you know, there's always challenges and technical issues that we encounter. And we just want to mention a few that we have seen through the progress of Sunnyside Manor 2. And one of them would be the sponsor and developer risk, because it does take a long time to, from beginning to end, to complete a preservation project. And you're taking on the risk of something going wrong and the project falling through at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, and investing your time and effort and in something that might not happen at the end. But in this case, it has been happy, and we are looking forward to closing sometime soon. But it has taken 3+ years, and by the time we're done, it'll probably be about 4.5 years total to from beginning to end. And then, as you know, there's the USDA RD process is very slow.
Yeah, one of the aspects of that, and it really does relate to the risk. You start out saying, well, we can get this done in, as I mentioned, in Oregon, a year and a half, something like that. Well, when you're 3 years down line, what has occurred is, as each month goes by, more of the principal on the rural development mortgage loan gets amortized, which means you're not assuming as much debt in the acquisition, and you're having to consume more of the development funding we've obtained to pay the seller cash. So I don't know an easy answer to make these acquisitions move faster, but certainly that's one of the things you got to have in mind at the outset, is that you better expect a significant period of time and that you've got to have sufficient funding to absorb that risk of the existing mortgage loan being paid down over that period of time it takes to close.
There's also additional environmental requirements that we've seen in the last year. The Housing Trust Fund started requesting meth testing, and that added cost to consult with third parties, and also it requires certification if the units return over the threshold or acceptable limit through the Washington State Department of Health. And fortunately for Sunnyside Manor, all the 12 units came back as under the threshold, and we didn't have to do any decontamination or mitigation or cleanup in this case. But we did have to do that on another project that we're working with Dave on, located in Sunnyside, where we had to do a cleanup certification, and it was additional time and cost in this case to the current seller. But those are additional requirements that need to be taken into consideration, and that need to be placed on the pre-development budget ahead of time, and it just adds another layer of time and also funding. And
it's you know, one more illustration of how you need to be nimble, because when we made the application to the Housing Trust Fund for the preservation funds, this requirement for meth testing was not included. It came up in moving towards contracting. We wouldn't be able to close unless we had the testing done. So it's not something that was predictable at the outset. And you do have to be, you know, quick on your feet to adjust to circumstances like that.
Mm-hmm. Also, the relocation cost is another issue or challenge that we have to deal with, because we don't have a grant or funding available through RD. The NPR has not been published, and from what we understand, there's a backlog in financing multiple projects at this time, so there's no funding available, and their funding does not apply to relocation costs. And also the Housing Trust Fund, it's also that's not allowed to pay for relocation costs. So that's another challenge that has to be taken care of, and we will need temporary relocation for the 12 residents as we move into rehabilitation work. And we are thinking of consulting a third-party professional to help us and assist us with this process.
The bullet point there that has to do with the acquisition tied to the transfer process. Our acquisition of Sunnyside Manor 1 was done by virtue of acquiring, in effect, the partnership interest rather than acquiring the real estate. Took a much shorter period of time. It was a much easier process. However, acquiring a partnership interest is not an eligible use of either home funds or of FHLB funds. So in effect, if we were going to make use of those funding sources, we had to go through RD's transfer process.
Mm-hmm. We also applied for home funding through the Yakima County Home Consortium for the purpose of using their home funds to cover some of the relocation costs. And unfortunately, the Yakima Home Consortium is having some issues, organizational issues, and those funds had to be withdrawn from this project. And next slide, please. Okay, do you have anything else to add, Dave?
Well, we very much appreciate being part of this academy and letting you know the adventure that we are experiencing in trying to preserve these properties. We're grateful to all the funding sources that we've got, and we do believe we'll get the job done. Happy to provide background information or answer questions. You know, if anybody else is encountering some of these types of challenges.
Thank you so much for this example and walking us through this. And right, sometimes a long time, Dave, thanks for pointing out that sometimes a long time allows for new funding sources to come available. That's not always the way it works, but I know it worked serendipitously for you all in this case, and $1 million of money from the state was huge to making this project a reality. Looking forward to getting through to the end of this project and y'all seeing that through all the way through. Really helpful to hear the perspective of the folks who are actually doing the work on the ground, and seeing that some of the challenges that aligned by relocation are the same, state to state, the need for additional sources outside of RD. We did see in chat that Brian Shelton Kelly had mentioned that the NPR, I think they applied for in 2016. They might close for, they might get the NPR funding that was accepted. So things are, yeah, that is a very slow, but NPR is a USDA program that does allow for this grant. It is just currently in backlog. So right now they're not allowing any new projects to apply for NPR funding until a new NOSA goes out from USDA. I just wanted to highlight that since some folks might not be familiar with that acronym. So with that, we're going to pass it along to, I believe, Charlie at ORF and others on that team so that we can hear from another case study, the state of Washington.
Great, thanks, Robin. Yeah, she mentioned my name is Charlie Hitchcock. I'm also a housing developer with Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing. Today I'll be talking to you about the Harborview Apartments located in scenic Friday Harbor, Washington. The owner of the project is Opportunity Council. Joining me today is Greg Winter, their executive director. And the development consultant, again, for this one is Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing. Next slide, please. So give you a little background on the apartments. They were initially constructed in 1985. They're located on an island in San Juan County, Friday Harbor. It's a 20-unit apartment building, including a manager unit. It's two two-story buildings, 12 one-bedroom units, and 8 two-bedroom units, one of which is ADA. Next slide, please. So when the project was initially acquired, there were 6 units with rental assistance. I mean, that's a key thing to consider when something first goes on the market. It entered prepayment initially in 2017, opening up that 180-day window for the buyer. And it was critical that this project both serve families under 50% of area median income, and as a result, not increasing tenant rents. And unfortunately, USDA was able to bring in an additional 13 units of rental assistance, which made that process quite a bit easier and made it easier for us to achieve that. So I guess move on to the next slide and hand things off to Greg Winter to speak a little bit about how Opportunity Council got involved in preservation and found this project.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And hi, everybody. I'm Greg Winter. I'm Executive Director of Opportunity Council. We are a community action agency one of 30 CAP agencies in the state of Washington, and our we have a kind of a complex geography, but in terms of housing, you know, development, housing preservation, housing services, we have a core service territory of 3 counties. For those of you familiar with Washington, that's Whatcom, Island, and San Juan counties. And as Charlie mentioned, San Juan is composed of a whole bunch of islands, and with 3 primary islands, San Juan Island being the largest and most populous, where Harborview is. So as you might discover if we get into Q&A, I'm not the details guy on this presentation. That's Charlie. But I can certainly speak to our motivation and how this project came about for us. So previous to my current role at Opportunity Council, I was the director of the Whatcom Homeless Service Center, which is Whatcom County's coordinated entry program that is part of, it's a department at Opportunity Council. And so I was promoted to executive director and took over that role in January 2016. And one of the first things that we did was, after I became executive director, is start up a housing development and property management department, because our strategic plan calls for us to do more in the way of housing development. And in my view, and the view of my board, if we're only building new units, but we're not paying attention to units we're losing either through gentrification or loss of subsidy, then what are we really accomplishing in the overall you know, housing stock and housing market? So we're very interested in preservation and didn't really know exactly how to target the opportunities. So we hired somebody to help us as a consultant comb through a whole bunch of data. So we hired, for those of you in Washington State, you may know Kayla Schott-Bressler, who works for Skagit County now, was with the Housing Development Consortium previous to that. But Kayla and I put our heads together and came up with a strategy that Kayla executed brilliantly to conduct a risk assessment. So using a variety of sources, we came up with an inventory in a 4-county area. We added Skagit County to our 3-county core area because it's in the same vicinity. And we looked at an inventory of subsidized multifamily properties that either had tax credit, you know, HUD or USDA subsidies. And like I said, it's about 200 properties, and we categorized them based on a number of criteria into 4 categories. Those that had fairly recently been lost, they'd lost their affordability, and so we weren't really paying attention to those. Those that were safe, where we didn't see that there was anything on the horizon over the next, you know, 20 years, where it looked like their affordability was at risk. And then those in the monitoring category, those where either we weren't sure, and through contacting the owners, we really didn't understand what their situation was, and those that were clearly at risk. And we identified 1 property that was the most at-risk property, currently in the prepayment process, and that was Harborview. So we quickly were able to target within our territory 1 property that really needed a rescue. And you know, being new into the development and preservation world, you know, we didn't have a lot of experience at this. Well, we had 0 experience. So we hired, with the help of a $25,000 grant from San Juan County, we hired ORF to help guide us through this process. And we also relied heavily on the expertise of one of our legal aid organizations, Northwest Justice Project. Kelly Owen at Northwest Justice really helped also advise us on how to proceed with this process. And unlike the previous example that you just heard about, I would not characterize the seller in this situation as being terribly enthusiastic. Let's just put it that way. So we were kind of up against a situation where we had what at times seemed to be an adverse relationship. We were trying to navigate our way through this. I should mention, for those of you who haven't done one of these projects before, but are interested in it, you may find people, like I had a couple of mentors, very experienced housing developers in other organizations. You know, when I told them what we were thinking about doing, they would do things like, oh, no, stay away, don't do that. You'll be sorry. You'll go down this endless road and it won't be successful. But we persevered with the help of ORF and Northwest Justice Project and our funding partners, and ultimately succeeded. So, you know, it was the other parts about this, getting the project started and making the decision to be the organization to step in and try to rescue this property. We also consulted with the other housing service providers in San Juan County because we hadn't previously had any significant footprint in terms of owning or developing any properties in San Juan County. So we wanted to make sure that, for example, the community land trusts and the other housing providers there did not have an interest in this, did not have a willingness to step in, because we would have preferred to you know, step back and have one of the local housing development organizations do that. So that was part of our process, was working with county government and those providers to ensure that we're not stepping on any toes. But yeah, there was nobody else that was willing to do this. So, you know, naively, but with the help of ORF and Northwest Justice, we stepped in. You know, I don't want to take up all the time because I'm really only here to speak about our motivation. And, you know, I can bring in, you know, Marty and Charlie to talk about some of the other aspects of this project that were really challenging. I'll say that in the process of working with the seller, one of the biggest hurdles that we had was that the seller was not willing to enter into a purchase and sale agreement until we had proven to their satisfaction. I'm trying to think of the way to put it, proven to their satisfaction that we had the resources to both pay for the acquisition and for the rehab that USDA would require, you know, pretty quickly after acquisition. So we relied on help from both the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, which the staff there and the organization was just wonderful to work with. They knew we were on a really tight timeline to try to show to the seller that we had resources we could bring to bear. So they entered into an agreement with us pledging $1.1 million of their land acquisition program to help us with the acquisition, which we ultimately didn't use because the Washington State Housing Trust Fund, State Department of Commerce's program, actually ended up providing that funding for us. So had it not been for one or the other of those funders, we probably wouldn't have been successful in getting the purchase and sale agreement that the sellers were willing to buy into. I think I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Charlie, but I'm here to, you know, we can make this more conversational. I'm happy to answer any questions by either the panelists or people participating in the Academy today.
Thanks, Greg. And yeah, if you have anything to add, feel free to jump back in. Yeah, as Greg mentioned, quite a few funding partners involved in this one. Not only is there the USDA debt deferral, which in this case was roughly $250,000. Could you go back and stay on the previous slide, please? Thanks. As Dave Roberts mentioned, a similar issue where it was kind of counting down as it was being amortized, because USDA had underwritten a different subsidized loan. In this case, they were able to provide the funding to pay the owner equity. And that was to the tune of a little over $1 million. Realizing I should probably put a sources and uses statement in the chat if anyone would like to see that. There was also a housing trust fund award of 1.1 million that was applied for in the 2017 round. Once that was put under contract, Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing is also a CDFI and lender, and We have the Preservation Revolving Loan Fund. It's a pass-through loan program that is backed by USDA. That was involved as well for $250,000. And Federal Home Loan Bank provided an award for this as well in the 2018 round for $250,000. This was initially envisioned to take out the, or as a replacement for the loan funds, but ultimately both were needed in this project. And local funding was also brought in from San Juan County multiple times in this project. There was initially a $25,000 award for feasibility. And then as construction went on, we uncovered several issues and ultimately needed additional funding to resolve them as it exceeded contingency. And they've brought in a little under $200,000 to take care of some issues that exceeded the initially anticipated construction scope. And this is unique to Opportunity Council. There's a Department of Commerce weatherization grant. It's a program that's typically for single family housing. It's something Opportunity Council was running before, but it was an opportunity to take credit for that weatherization work. I mean, you can see the new wrap going up on the building there, and get roughly $42,000 added in as grant funding. All of this adds up to a TDC of around 3.1 million. The purchase price was 1.3 million. And there was also, the seller ultimately required some extension payments, so that added to the ticking clock of getting this closed as well. I can move on to the next slide and talk through some of the technical issues we worked through. So the project, as you can see, is under construction. We're hoping to have that wrapped up by June of this year. But yeah, in order to get it closed, that was quite a process. I think the closing ultimately happened in June of 2019 after the NPR debt deferral was applied for, as well as the USDA funds. All the funding was committed, and once that happened, it took roughly 6 months to get closed. The urgency was communicated to USDA, and thankfully it all got done by June of 2019. The scope of work has been through multiple iterations on this project. Once, again, the advantages of delays, being able to add in additional funds, expanded what we initially thought the scope of work of this project was going to be to get a lot of interior work done, because this was required on the capital needs assessment. It became clear, and with that deadline, that this would need to be a two-step process. So going into it with that full scope of work with the interior was what we needed to get it closed. One of the technical challenges we ran into was the soft debt ineligibility. That's the way Department of Commerce grants are awarded. I think Dave and Isabel brought this up as well. Thankfully, Department of Commerce and HTF were able to adjust the nature of their award to make it hard debt, able to bring out that language and get it into that funding stack. Now, once it did get closed, it took quite a bit of time to find a contractor and bring them out there. This is on an island. It's only accessible by ferry. It takes roughly an hour and a half from Anacortes, which is already a little bit of a remote corner of Washington. So it was challenging to find an interested contractor that had all the qualifications we needed. And thankfully, Opportunity Council was working with a firm that was doing some work out there on the island for a different project, and we were able to bring them on. But even then, it took a significant amount of work for them to find subs that were interested. And this ultimately led to a pretty significant cost overrun. The project closed in 2019. We weren't able to get a bid from the interested contractor until February or March of 2020. And once we did get those bids in, they were significantly above what we expected. The CNA does have values for what they anticipate the cost will be. It did not anticipate the challenges of building in such a remote location where overhead costs are higher for the contractor, not just because of transport, but because of having a place to stay. As ultimately, we needed to significantly pare down the scope. Basically went down to envelope. The roof was in dire need of repair and accessibility, which is a mandate of USDA. Accessibility is one of the most important things to them, and it's always going to be prioritized. Now, prior to starting construction as well, since there was such a big change to the scope, USDA required a competitive bid waiver. Since there was only one interested contractor, we didn't do a sealed bid process. It was more of a negotiated bid, which ended up being very necessary in determining what they could do. USDA required a competitive bid waiver to just break down why it was a fair bid, the qualifications of the contractor. It wasn't necessarily a huge burden, but it did add another month or two and another thing for their national office to approve as we approach construction. We were able to get that approved and hold the pre-construction conference and issue a notice to proceed in August of 2020. Obviously, the challenges of 2020 led to some of the delays in getting things moving. But yeah, they were able to get the new roof on before the rain came in. However, yeah, there was, it's a 35-year-old building in a very damp climate, and a lot of mold and rot were uncovered during construction, both in that roof. The main issue there, you can see the decks being replaced. The deck joists had rotted out, and this added a significant amount of cost. Issues were also uncovered in the laundry room. And part of it was a result of a drainage issue that hadn't been fully uncovered. And again, thankfully, San Juan County was able to step in. Opportunity Council has a good relationship with them and provide funding to improve the drainage on the site. And yeah, thankfully, construction is projected to be completed in a few months. The ADA tenant is currently out of the unit, and that work is happening as we speak. And it's definitely a longer process than was previously envisioned. I mean, it's going to be roughly 4 months from when the initial offer and feasibility were put into completion. Not necessarily a big financial return. This was certainly mission-driven work for both the Opportunity Council and ORF, but the project has been preserved and quite possibly the only affordable housing on that island. It's very key for that community, and we're thankful to be seeing it completed.
Yeah, I think, in listening to you, Charlie, I'm thinking back. This has been a long time that we've been involved in this. And some of the reflections I've got going on in my head right now are how surprising it was to me working with USDA staff. It really ended up making a difference which staff person we worked with. And I don't want to, say anything bad about USDA overall, but that was a real surprise to me that, there seemed like there were a lot of roadblocks. In fact, I remember calling up, Mary and saying, hey, it appears like you don't even want to preserve this housing. Sometimes it got to that point where I thought there were so many roadblocks being put in the way that that things were maybe designed to facilitate, for-profit sales. And I know that's not the case, but when you're deep into it, some of you who embark on a journey like this may find running up against a brick wall. But when we worked with a different staff person, it was like night and day. And Jan Darling, who we've been working with, she's just been terrific. She's been a great resource, super supportive, really understanding of some of our concerns and issues and the unique situation. And I'm sure there's unique qualities to every one of these acquisitions.
Definitely. I think certainly when we were working on this, there was some inconsistency with how USDA handled it. I think part of the goal of the reorganization has been to make it a more consistent process, no matter who you're working with. But yeah, very thankful for their support on this one. So I guess we can open up for questions. I've already gotten one from Dave Roberts to talk about relocation. And again, thankfully, well, I guess a silver lining to having to cut out all the interior scope is, for the most part, we have not had to worry about relocation. It was only just for the one tenant. And that's at a scale where it didn't really make sense to bring in a consultant. USDA is also not particularly, they're not bringing in a ton of oversight on that. Another key detail about this I don't think we brought up is that Opportunity Council retained a management firm that was on the site. That was one less thing to worry about during the transfer process, since the same organization would be running it. I think just the scale, the location of it was something that made that decision easier. Dave, I don't know if you want to speak to that decision. But having a management consultant who was familiar with URA and all of that made things easier with getting all the notifications for when they're working on the stairs and tenants might need to be out of their units, and all of that quite a bit easier.
Yeah, it was easy for us to make the decision to keep the same property management firm involved. My understanding is they've been involved since Harborview was built, or almost that long, if not that long. And because of the distance from our property management headquarters, there was a lot of reasons that made sense to keep them involved.
Well, I just want to thank you both for sharing this example and like the other examples we've heard. There's lots of, I think patience has been a through line for all of the projects that we've heard about. This one, I was listening to all the dates, Greg, that you were mentioning about when you secured the Federal Home Loan Bank dollars, and many of those dates were in the teens, and we are in 2021 now. So I'm sure that I wonder if there were challenges because you had an award from Federal Home Loan Bank, for example, in 2018, it not closing until not finishing construction, if there's been challenges with other sources because the timelines have been prolonged.
Yeah, that I'll defer to Charlie on that, but I don't think that's actually been a problem. And interesting point to bring up here is that during that time period, we had been, Opportunity Council had been consulting with San Juan County, various stakeholders there about developing a new local dedicated source of funding for housing development and preservation. And that's because Opportunity Council had been very involved in developing the Bellingham Home Fund, which is a property tax levy for affordable housing. And so we kind of been carrying that message to other jurisdictions in our service territory. And so during that time period, that interim from 2016 to now, San Juan County went to the voters to pass a real estate excise tax that funds now a dedicated housing fund. So the couple $100,000 that Charlie mentioned that San Juan County has invested in this project for things that we didn't know we would need during this construction project, that wouldn't have even been available if we had done everything really quickly.
Right. That sort of looks like how Dave had mentioned, new sources kind of came available with a prolonged time frame. So sometimes it can be both a blessing and of course it is challenging, though. Lots of good conversation happening in the chat. Folks feel like this is familiar to them, and shout outs for some partners that you have in common with other groups. So also just a lot of these projects have happened as USDA realigned. And so some folks in the chat too have kind of mentioned that has created additional delays in the process. And we're hoping that those delays get mitigated, you know, as the realignment becomes more clear and as we move along with a new set of consistent guidelines for that. I want to open it up for any other questions. Oh, sorry, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to ask Marty if there's anything that he thought I was going to say that I didn't say.
Hi, Greg, and great job to you and Charlie. One thing I thought was interesting that came up during the process was the context was prepayment, you know, which is a different path than transfer. And I thought it might be interesting for folks to hear about your initial thought of forming an LLC or a limited partnership to control it, but then the eligibility issues that emerged.
Yeah, and that's another one of those details that I can't explain, but maybe you and Charlie can. Yeah, we like to have that extra, risk protection for our organization by forming LLCs as the ownership entity for the housing projects that we have since developed or taken ownership of, and that was not allowed under this acquisition, and it was a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, but it was just not going to happen. I mean, our housing developer at that time, Jenny Weinstein, tried everything she could to work with the USDA to get them to allow that, to consider the LLC as a nonprofit because it's wholly owned by a nonprofit. But that didn't work. And I don't know if you have any additional thoughts about that, Marty.
Well, just briefly, and it's, I guess, a word of caution to folks who might be engaging in the prepayment process is that just like Greg was saying, RD has a very clear and precise definition that you must be a nonprofit in order to be eligible to enter into a purchase and sale agreement within that 180-day period of marketing. So the wholly LLC seemed like a very reasonable approach, and we were equally surprised and disappointed that didn't work. But it's a word of caution for those who may be entering the prepayment process in the future.
Yeah, I think that could be a roadblock to more risk-averse boards and organizations, and so that could be I don't know how we get that changed, but it seems like a pretty simple change to me that if the LLC is wholly owned by a nonprofit organization, it's considered a nonprofit. But that's just me.
No, that's not just you. That is a common model, and I think that there's some inconsistencies about how that's approved through the system and through the agency. And so thinking about how hopefully within realignment and some of these other streamlined processes, that there's consistency with how that's viewed, because that's, I think, one of the challenges is it's not, some groups have been allowed to do it that way and others have not. I think one other common theme, and we're at right about the end of the hour, is thinking about those relocation costs too. So as we build out some of these conversations of nuts and bolts with ORF and with our partners, as we develop the rest of the sessions for the Academy, thinking about how we talk about thinking about those relocation costs and the concept of third party. Marty and Charlie, I'm thinking about that, and I have some coming sessions coming up to make sure that that's addressed. We do have a question I think from Seth. What does the process look like for soliciting bids from the general contractor for this project, or any difficult to develop area?
So I mean, I just issued an RFQ just for a general contractor. I mean, obviously one of the qualifications was knowing that it was experience in remote areas, and I think we reached out to some firms that we knew had some experience between Opportunity Council, ORF, and the architecture firm. But ultimately, the one we selected, HB Hansen, out of Linden, Washington, was the only qualified respondent. So made the selection process quite a bit easier. And I'd rather have one, qualified contractor than 5 unqualified ones. So it was, thankful to them on board.
Yeah, and it's interesting that at the time they were also in the middle of building a food bank for us on the mainland in Bellingham. So we had great experience with this contractor. So that's a little kind of unique situation for us there. But yeah, definitely challenging to find qualified contractors that aren't already super busy, especially in these remote places.
And yeah, I mean, having experience with federal funding sources was a big deal as well. They're working on something, I think, for American Camp out on that island. And yeah, I think that's just having patience with the patience a contractor needs with those sources is not something you see from everybody too. So.
Yeah, and I heard from our examples in Oregon earlier too that this has been an issue in parts of rural Oregon as well, and with state requirements about minority and women-owned businesses having to be part of that pool, and just being able to, even if you can only get one contractor to answer your RFQ, it's hard to then show that you've done due diligence to meet that additional requirement as well. And so thinking about how sometimes those requirements with very good intentions are really hard to work out on the ground, as we work in really rural, not just rural and remote, right? Specifically in the case of like an island, this is it's a challenging place to get to. And also then I think also the added cost for the contractor, and then therefore for the total development cost, is really important to factor into as we pursue these projects. So to everyone's point, these are mission driven. If we didn't have a mission to do this work, these projects would not get done. And so I am just really appreciative to have others who have that mission and who are working in Washington, like you are, like the Dave, and with the groups that Christy and all of those who have been sharing, Shelley, who've been sharing, doing that work in rural communities in Washington and in Oregon today, because this work really requires patience, but that has to be rooted in mission and real commitment to helping these residents stay in their homes and then improve their homes as part of that process as well. And that's really important and key that we all keep that in mind. And if we don't have that really at the bottom of what we do, I don't think any of this work really gets done. So it is the end of our time. It was a great session. Thank you so much to all of our guest panelists, to Orf, to Rob at NOAA, and to all of the developers who spoke and presented case studies. Our next session is May 12th, working on that session for you. Looking forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, have find some joy in your days, and we will see you then. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.